Imagine being told that your job isn't actually something you just do from 9 to 5.
Yeah, which is pretty much how we view every career today.
I mean, imagine being told that taking a position doesn't just mean, signing a contract or taking on some new responsibilities.
Right, well, rather that it's undergoing this fundamental rewriting of your human DNA.
Yes, that your personality, your time, your very existence is now the property of another.
It's a huge concept to wrap your head around.
It really is. Today, we are not looking at a standard job description for you guys. We are looking at an ontological shock to the system.
And that's a perfect way to put it, because usually when we look for a role in society, we want clean boundaries.
Yeah, we want a nice, clean, organizational chart. We look for a functional description of what we are supposed to do.
But today, we're plunging into a deep dive that shatters that modern corporate expectation entirely.
We really are. We're looking at a massive, complex collection of texts. We have homilies, speeches, letters, and these incredibly extensive, unscripted Q&A sessions.
All delivered by Pope Benedict XVI.
Yeah, all during what the Catholic Church called the Year for Priests, which ran from June 2009 to June 2010.
And the mission of this deep dive is to uncover Benedict XVI's profound, almost startling theological vision of the Catholic priesthood.
Because if you go into this source material looking for, like, a community organizer or a social worker in a Roman collar, you are going to be fundamentally disoriented.
Oh, for sure. These texts reveal a radical, all-consuming vocation.
We're going to explore this idea of an ontological change, the absolute necessity of prayer, and why authentic preaching requires a painful but beautiful self-emptying.
Basically checking your ego entirely at the door.
Okay, let's unpack this. We have a mountain of source material here.
We really do.
And it ranges from these highly formal global encyclicals to these intimate, off-the-cuff dialogues with parish priests in Rome.
Which honestly read like intense therapy sessions at times.
They really do.
Yeah.
So to set the stage for all of this, we need to understand the catalyst for this specific year.
Yeah, because it provides the lens through which Benedict views everything else in these texts.
So why did he call for this year in the first place?
Well, Benedict inaugurated the year for priests to mark the 150th anniversary of the death of St. John Mary Vianney.
Okay, and for those who might not know, who is he?
He is known historically as the Curé of Ars. Now, Vianney was a 19th century small-town parish priest in France.
A pretty obscure guy originally, right?
Very obscure. He was not a great intellectual. In fact, he struggled mightily in seminary.
Oh, wow, really?
Yeah, he barely made it through his Latin classes. But he became a towering figure in Catholic history simply through his staggering dedication.
I see.
Vianney famously said, "The priesthood is the love of the heart of Jesus."
And that single quote kind of serves as the beating heart for this entire corpus of texts, doesn't it?
It really does.
Mm.
The goal of the year was never just to, celebrate priests or throw a global appreciation party.
Yeah, that would be missing the point.
The goal was to invite a profound interior renewal for priests worldwide, drawing on Vianney's example.
An example of radical, almost terrifying dedication to the spiritual lives of his people.
Yes, which means before we can even look at what a priest actually does in his day-to-day life, we have to understand what Benedict says a priest actually is.
And that brings us to a major underlying tension that runs through almost all of these sources.
You can really feel it in the text.
Reading through these speeches, you can feel Benedict pushing back against the spirit of the age.
He is observing a world that has completely changed how it evaluates human worth and human roles.
It's a profound tension between two distinct views of the priesthood in the modern world, isn't it?
Yeah. Benedict identifies this prevalent trend, particularly in the West, where the priesthood is viewed merely as a social function.
Like evaluating it through a completely secular lens.
Yes. In a highly secular, globalized, and corporate society, functionality is the ultimate metric of value.
If you aren't producing something measurable, you aren't valuable.
That's the mindset. So the priest is seen through that lens. He's someone who runs a parish like a nonprofit organization.
He organizes the community, he balances the budget, or he provides psychological comfort to the grieving.
That is the functional concept. The value of the priest, in this view, is entirely dependent on his output.
His efficiency and his measurable social utility. But Benedict rejects that functional view entirely, doesn't he?
He completely dismantles it. He looks at this idea of the priest as just a highly educated social worker and says that is fundamentally insufficient.
Because it misses the core reality of what happened to the man on the day of his ordination.
Yes, he contrasts it with the Catholic sacramental ontological reality.
Let's break that down, because ontological is a heavy philosophical word.
It is. For Benedict, ordination is not a hiring process.
It's not like the congregation delegating a community role to someone.
No, it is an ontological change. When we talk about ontology, we are talking about the philosophical study of being.
The very nature of what something is at its core.
It's exactly what, yeah, that's it. So Benedict is arguing that through the sacrament of holy orders, the very being of the man is fundamentally altered.
It is a permanent mark on the soul.
He becomes, as the texts repeat multiple times, totally inserted into Christ.
The man is no longer just a man who performs priestly duties.
His identity is reconfigured at the deepest metaphysical level.
The analogy that kept coming to my mind while reading this is that it's not like putting on a uniform for a shift.
Oh, that's a great way to think about it.
Like if you are a police officer or a doctor, you wear the uniform, you perform the duties, but at the end of the day, you take the uniform off.
And you are just yourself again. You compartmentalize.
Yeah. But Benedict is saying this is more like your actual DNA being rewritten.
You don't just do priestly things between 9 and 5.
You are a priest, whether you are celebrating Mass, sleeping, or walking down the street.
It is an inescapable reality of your being. That genetic metaphor captures the permanence Benedict is insisting upon.
And the texts use a specific Latin phrase for this, right?
Yes, in persona Christi capitis.
Meaning the priest acts in the person of Christ the head.
Benedict is meticulous in explaining the mechanics of this.
How does he explain it?
He says that during the consecration of the Eucharist, or the absolution of sins in the confessional, the priest's human I, his individual identity, is united to Christ's divine I.
Okay, think about the words spoken in the confessional.
The priest does not say, Christ forgives you, or God absolves you.
He says, I absolve you.
Benedict points out the staggering weight of that pronoun.
It's huge, because it's not the human man who forgives.
No human man has the power to forgive sins committed against God.
It is God acting directly, physically, and audibly through him.
The priest has lent his voice, his hands, and his very being to Christ.
When I read that, my 21st century alarm bells immediately went off.
I can imagine. It's a challenging concept.
I hear ontological change, and I hear this idea that the priest's I is consumed by Christ's I.
And in our modern mindset, that sounds almost dangerous.
It sounds like losing your individuality. It raises the question, does this mean the priest loses his own personality?
If his DNA is rewritten, does he just become a blank robotic vessel with no personal characteristics?
Yeah, just echoing words without any of his own humanity left.
Benedict actually anticipates that exact modern fear, the fear of losing one's autonomy.
How does he address it?
He addresses it by explaining that the priest becomes the property of God. He frequently uses the phrase belonging to another.
Now, in our contemporary individualistic context, where autonomy is the highest possible good, becoming someone's property sounds alarming.
It sounds almost dystopian, yeah.
But Benedict argues from a completely different philosophical starting point, doesn't he?
He argues that belonging to God does not destroy the priest's personality. Rather, it grounds it.
What's the logic behind that?
The logic is that God is the creator. By giving himself entirely back to the creator who designed him, the priest finds his truest, most authentic self.
So the human ego is not obliterated.
No, it is elevated and purified.
The priest's unique humor, his intellect, his specific background, all of that is retained.
But it is now harnessed entirely for a divine purpose.
That reframes so much of what we assume about individual freedom.
It really does. We usually think of freedom as the ability to do whatever we want, whenever we want.
But Benedict is suggesting that true freedom for the priest is found in total surrender.
Now, reading through these sources, it becomes clear that this ontological belonging provides the only logical framework for understanding clerical celibacy.
Yeah, let's talk about celibacy, because if you look at it purely from a functional HR perspective, it makes no sense.
It just looks like a harsh disciplinary measure to free up the priest's schedule.
Like just a way so he can work more hours without a family distracting him.
Which is exactly how secular media often portrays it as an outdated management policy.
But Benedict completely elevates the conversation.
He does not frame celibacy merely as a practical rule. He frames it as an authentic prophecy of the kingdom of God.
And a sign of a totally undivided heart.
Because the priest belongs entirely to another. Because his very being has been rewired to act in persona Christi. His celibacy is a physical, lived reality of that total self-gift.
The texts call it an eschatological sign, right?
Yes, meaning it points to the end of times, to heaven, where Christ says people will neither marry nor be given in marriage.
So the priest lives that future reality right now in the present.
As a visible witness that God alone is enough to satisfy the human heart.
It is a radical bodily assertion of the truth of the gospel.
But it leads to a very practical problem.
Which is?
If the priest's identity is this profound ontological rewriting, how does a human being actually sustain that without snapping under the pressure?
Because looking at these unscripted Q&A sessions between Benedict and the parish priests, these guys were exhausted.
You can feel the tension and the burnout in their questions.
They are living in a busy, modern world, dealing with parish emergencies, administrative headaches, shrinking resources.
And a culture that largely ignores them or is hostile to them.
This leads us directly to Benedict's intense, almost unrelenting focus on prayer and sacred scripture as the lifeline.
The tension the priests describe in those transcripts is palpable. They are speaking to the Pope, and they were essentially saying, we feel a heavy burden.
We feel completely inadequate for this task.
And a striking psychological reality emerges from Benedict's response.
He notes that priests today often feel guilty taking time away from parish emergencies to pray.
The modern mindset has infected them too.
They feel that if they are sitting in silence in an empty church, they are wasting time.
They feel they are neglecting the marginalized, ignoring an urgent administrative crisis, or failing to be productive.
But Benedict insists forcefully that this is a deception.
He states that prayer is pastoral work.
It is not a break from the work. It is the very engine of the work.
Think about the burnout we all face in the corporate world when we rely entirely on our own performance.
It's unsustainable. Benedict's solution for priests completely flips our modern productivity metrics upside down.
He uses this Latin phrase, multum oravit pro fratribus.
Translated, it means he prayed much for the brethren.
Benedict delves into the profound intercessory role of the priest here.
The priest is the one who stands before God, praying on behalf of those who cannot, will not, or do not know how to pray.
The secular world might be entirely oblivious to it, but the priest is carrying the joys, the sorrows, the quiet desperation, and the anxieties of his entire flock.
He carries all of that into his personal dialogue with God.
If he abandons that dialogue to focus solely on activism, on just doing more things, he is actually failing his people at the most fundamental level.
Because he is cutting them off from the divine grace he is supposed to mediate.
There's a quote in the sources from St. Bernard of Clairvaux, an 11th century abbot, that Benedict brings up to illustrate this.
Yeah, Bernard is writing to a former student of his who unexpectedly became pope.
And he gives him this harsh but necessary advice. He tells him he must drink from his own well.
That's such a brilliant psychological and spiritual insight.
The concept is that a priest must internalize his own humanity and his own faith before he can pour it out for others.
He must experience the living water of Christ in his own interior life.
He has to actually believe the things he is saying. He has to have a vibrant, living relationship with God.
If his well is dry, if his interior life is dead, he has absolutely nothing to offer the thirsty people coming to him for help.
He just becomes an empty functionalist, repeating hollow phrases.
And people can sense that emptiness. To keep that well full, Benedict points to very specific daily practices.
He isn't just speaking in vague spiritual terms. He gives them a regimen.
He emphasizes the liturgy of the hours, which is the daily prayer of the church, and the daily celebration of the Eucharist.
And looking at the liturgy of the hours, this is an immense commitment.
It involves praying the Psalms at specific times throughout the day, every single day.
He stresses that the liturgy of the hours, or the breviary, immerses the priest in the Psalms and the Scriptures.
Benedict explores the psychology of this, doesn't he?
He says this is not just reading a text to gain information. It is entering into the prayer of all the ages.
When a modern, exhausted priest is reading ancient poetry at midnight, he is praying with the people of the Old Covenant.
He is praying with the church fathers, and he is giving a voice to the suffering people of today.
It acts as a constant, daily recentering of his mind away from his own problems and into the mind of the church.
And then there's the daily Eucharist. Benedict calls the daily celebration of the Mass the school of life for the priest.
Why does he call it a school of life?
Because it is where the priest learns day by day that he did not possess his life for himself.
He holds the host and says, "This is my body given up for you."
If he says those words every single day with intention, it fundamentally changes how he views his own time, his own energy, and his own body.
He is practicing the act of self-donation.
Synthesizing this section on prayer, it comes down to a simple but brutal truth.
A priest cannot give what he does not have.
If he isn't constantly breathing in the Word of God through prayer, he will suffocate in his own activism.
He will just be a guy in a collar organizing bake sales.
Which falls completely short of the sacramental reality of bringing God to the world.
It's a huge danger. So once the priest is filled with the Word through that intense regimen of prayer, he has to go out and actually proclaim it.
He has to speak to the people.
And this brings us to one of the most intellectually challenging parts of the texts.
Benedict argues that true, authentic preaching is fundamentally tied to a concept called kenosis.
To understand the weight of this, we need to define that term. What is kenosis?
Kenosis is a Greek word used deeply in Christian theology to describe Christ's ultimate act of self-emptying.
It refers to the Son of God emptying himself of his divine glory.
Not clinging to his equality with God, but taking the form of a human servant, ultimately suffering on the cross.
Benedict takes this massive theological concept of Christ's self-emptying and applies it directly to the priest's daily life.
Specifically to his preaching.
To see how he applies it, we need to look at the three offices of the priest that the texts constantly refer to.
The Church uses Latin to categorize these duties. They are known as the tria munera.
These are the three fundamental duties of the ordained minister.
Right, well, they are the munus docendi, which is the duty of teaching.
The munus sanctificandi, which is the duty of sanctifying.
And the munus regendi, which is the duty of governing.
When discussing the duty of teaching, the proclamation of the word in homilies and instruction, Benedict brings up a stark and powerful image from the Gospel of John to warn the priests.
He references the passage where Jesus says, "I am the door, and anyone who climbs into the sheepfold another way is a thief and a robber."
Benedict uses that specific image of climbing over the fence to call out the ever-present temptation of careerism in the church.
He tells the priests that using the priesthood to gain a prominent position, to make oneself feel important, or to build a personal following of admirers is completely illegitimate.
It is the action of a thief.
The only legitimate ascent to the priesthood is the descent to the cross.
And that is exactly where the kenosis comes into play.
A priest must undergo his own brutal self-emptying to preach authentically.
He cannot consider himself the master of the word, but its humble servant.
Benedict points out that a priest must never preach his own invented philosophies or his own clever political theories to gain admirers.
He is merely the voice of the word, much like John the Baptist calling out in the wilderness,
pointing away from himself and toward Christ.
The metaphor I kept coming back to while reading his instructions on preaching is that the priest is supposed to be like a perfectly clear pane of glass.
That's a powerful visual.
If the glass is covered in the dirt of his own ego, his own desperate need to be liked by his congregation, or his own overly clever theological theories,
the listener just sees the dirt.
Yeah, they just see the man.
Yeah.
The priest has to be perfectly transparent so the light of Christ hits the listener directly without interference.
But realistically, reading these Q&A sessions, you see the struggle.
How does a guy stay transparent when his entire parish council or the surrounding culture is demanding he adopt whatever the cultural trend of the week is?
It seems almost impossible. The priests in those unscripted sessions voice that exact concern.
They are on the front lines.
They face a society that is often indifferent or aggressively hostile to the traditional Christian message.
They feel immense pressure to soften the message, to make it more palatable, to blend in.
Benedict's instruction here is uncompromising. He tells them the priest must have the courage to resist what he famously calls the dictatorship of weak reasoning.
Or positivism. He explicitly tells them not to submit to the hypotheses of the moment.
He says you cannot just echo what the newspapers are saying and call it a homily.
Because those cultural and philosophical fashions change from decade to decade.
Benedict, having lived through the ideological shifts of the 20th century, knows this intimately.
If a priest preaches the trendy philosophy of his specific era to be popular with his current parishioners, his message will be utterly obsolete in 10 years.
It has no lasting power. Benedict urges priests to rely on the permanent, enduring truth of the Church.
The kenosis, the self-emptying in this context, requires the intellectual humility to not try to be the smartest, most original, most avant-garde thinker in the room.
The true intellectual rigor is faithfully transmitting a truth that is much larger than oneself, even when it invites mockery.
Now, emptying oneself of ego and becoming transparent does not mean the priest becomes some detached, emotionless robot.
No, not at all. The DNA rewrite we talked about doesn't erase his humanity.
In fact, Benedict places an enormous recurring emphasis on the priest's human maturity.
And his necessary role in the incredibly messy reality of human suffering.
He explicitly rejects what he calls the Platonic ideal, right?
Yes, in that ancient philosophical framework, the perfect man lives solely in the contemplation of beautiful, abstract truths.
Remaining aloof and leaving the dirty physical work of the world to others.
Benedict says the Catholic priest cannot withdraw to an Elysium, a detached paradise of abstract theological thought.
He cannot just sit in his rectory reading Aquinas while his people suffer.
He has to enter into human wretchedness. He has to get his hands dirty.
He must take the passion of his parish upon his own shoulders.
Benedict insists that to be a true man of God, the priest must first be a true, fully integrated human being.
He needs a balanced mind, a properly integrated sexuality, and deep emotional maturity.
He must develop his intelligence, yes, but also his affections.
He has to know how to grieve with a mother who lost a child and how to rejoice at a wedding.
He cannot be emotionally stunted.
And this requirement of true humanity applies directly to the other two offices we mentioned earlier.
Sanctifying and governing.
Let's talk about the munus sanctificandi, the duty of sanctifying.
In this role, the priest brings people into direct contact with the absolute truth and grace of God via the sacraments.
Benedict highlights the sacrament of confession heavily here.
Think about what happens in a confessional. The priest sits in a small room encountering people who have been completely stripped of their societal roles.
They aren't CEOs or successful parents in that moment.
They're dealing with their raw humanity, their darkest sins, their addictions, and their profound failures.
The priest needs immense emotional maturity to hear that day after day.
Not to be crushed by the weight of human depravity, and to provide the authentic embrace of divine mercy.
And in the munus regendi, the duty of governing, the texts clarify that this is not about tyranny.
It's not about clericalism or rigid administrative control.
Governing means exercising the unconditional love of the Good Shepherd.
It means guiding the flock, protecting them from harm.
And sometimes using the shepherd's staff to boldly defend the faith against distortion, even when it makes the priest unpopular.
But this brings up a huge question. If the priest's identity is ontologically tied to Christ,
and he is called to this profound standard of human maturity and self-emptying,
what happens when the human vessel fails?
Because it is impossible to read these texts from the year for priests without addressing the immense shadow hanging over them.
During this exact time frame, from 2009 to 2010, the devastating sins of priests came to light.
Specifically, the horrific abuse of minors on a massive global scale.
The media coverage was relentless, the institutional failures were exposed, and the moral authority of the church was deeply shaken.
How did Benedict reconcile his high theological vision of the priesthood with this grotesque human failure?
It is the most critical tension of the entire year.
If we connect this staggering reality of abuse to the bigger picture of everything we have discussed,
the ontological change, acting in persona Christi, the kenosis, and the pastoral charity of the Good Shepherd.
The abuse crisis represents a catastrophic, almost demonic inversion of the priesthood.
The sources show Benedict's theological and deeply personal reaction to this reality.
He doesn't shy away from the contradiction. He faces it directly.
He frames it by saying that the abuse turned the priesthood into its absolute opposite.
Think about the gravity of that. A priest is ordained to bring life, to heal, and to make God's loving concern present in the world.
Instead, the abuser weaponized that sacred trust to cause profound, lasting trauma.
It is the ultimate betrayal of the kenosis.
Instead of self-emptying love, the priest engaged in predatory selfishness.
Instead of transparency to Christ, the priest became a vehicle for profound evil.
Benedict recognized that this contradiction threatened the very credibility of everything he was trying to teach.
In one of the closing texts of the year, Benedict notes that the year for priests could have been completely ruined.
Completely invalidated by these revelations if the year was just about glorifying human performance.
Or throwing a party for the clergy.
But because the foundation was about repentance and returning to the heart of Christ, the crisis took on a different meaning.
Benedict frames the crisis not as a reason to abandon the theology of the priesthood,
but as a severe divine summons to purification.
He calls for deeper humility across the entire church,
recognizing the biblical reality that the immense treasure of the priesthood is held in earthen vessels.
And those earthen vessels can crack, and they can fail catastrophically.
The sources show his absolute insistence on rigorous discernment in seminaries.
He emphasizes that candidates must actually possess the human, psychological, and emotional maturity required for this life,
So that the priesthood is never again used as a hiding place for pathology or unaddressed trauma.
It was a call to clean house, driven by the very theology of the priesthood we've been discussing.
In light of the dangers of power, the trap of ego, and the horrific potential for abuse when authority is twisted, how does a priest stay grounded?
How does he avoid the trap of clericalism, where he views himself as superior to the laity?
Benedict points directly to the physical center of the church, the altar.
He views the Eucharist as the ultimate antidote to clericalism.
To understand why he says this, we have to look at how Benedict defines the Eucharist.
For him, the Mass is not merely a communal ritual or a nice gathering to remember Jesus.
It is the great adventure of God's love.
It is the ultimate act of God stepping out of himself to be intimately present with humanity.
Lowering himself to become vulnerable and present in the simple elements of bread and wine.
And the act of celebrating the Eucharist forces the priest to enter physically and spiritually into this exact same dynamic.
He can't just be an observer. The Mass acts as a daily school of liberation from the eye.
When the priest stands at the altar holding the host and says the words of institution, "This is my body," he is swept up into Christ's total self-abandonment.
If he truly understands what he is doing, he is forced to leave his own ego, his own desires, and his own pride behind.
He is participating in a love that gives itself entirely for others.
A priest who truly lives the Eucharist cannot be a clericalist,
Because clericalism is about taking power for oneself.
while the Eucharist is about giving oneself completely away.
Wait, but realistically, looking at modern pastoral debates, I have to challenge this a bit.
Okay, what's the challenge?
Doesn't a hyper-focus on the altar, the tabernacle, and the intricacies of liturgy risk making the priest totally disconnected from the real world?
I see where you're going with this.
If he is always focused on the sanctuary, always praying before the tabernacle, isn't there a huge risk that he is ignoring the streets?
Ignoring the poor and ignoring systemic injustice.
Yeah, it seems like it could just be another form of withdrawing from the world.
That is a very common and very valid modern critique, and it was actually posed to Benedict during the Roman clergy meetings.
How does she respond to that?
His response is brilliant because he uses a powerful, universally recognized counterexample to dismantle that dichotomy between the altar and the streets.
Who was the counterexample?
Mother Teresa of Calcutta.
Oh, wow. Mother Teresa is globally recognized, even by secular humanitarians, for her grueling work in the slums.
Dealing with the most destitute, diseased, and marginalized people on earth.
You cannot accuse her of ignoring the streets.
No, you can't. And Benedict points out to the priests that her radical, one-changing apostolate was completely impossible without the tabernacle.
Her community, the Missionaries of Charity, spent hours in silent Eucharistic adoration every single morning before they ever stepped foot into the slums.
Benedict explains the mechanics of this. Abandonment to the poor, facing that overwhelming level of human suffering, disease, and despair daily, will eventually break a person.
It leads to burnout, cynicism, and despair.
That kind of grueling service is sustained only by abandoning oneself first to the God who gives himself.
The Eucharist, when understood in its true depth, does not trap the priest in the sanctuary.
It obliges him to love others. It pushes him outward with a strength that is not his own.
It is the exact opposite of closed-off, self-serving clericalism.
So, synthesizing this profound, complex journey through the year for priests corpus.
We have seen how Benedict XVI views the priesthood in a way that utterly defies modern categorization.
It is not a functional career. It is not a community management role.
It is an ontological rewiring,
It is a life that can only be sustained by a massive commitment to prayer.
marked by the severe self-emptying of the cross and poured out for humanity through the incredibly messy reality of the sacraments.
It is a vision that challenges the priest to live in a constant state of tension.
To be simultaneously tethered to the eternal realities of God and deeply, compassionately embedded in the broken human condition.
And for you listening, regardless of your background, your profession, or your own religious beliefs, understanding this material provides a fascinating masterclass.
A masterclass in the Catholic Church's highest, most demanding vision for spiritual leadership.
Even if you aren't Catholic, it exposes the heavy burden of true service.
The absolute necessity of checking your ego to serve a higher truth, and the staggering weight of a man being asked to stand in the place of the divine.
The texts leave us with a deeply philosophical and theological concept to mull over, drawn directly from that moment at the altar.
When a human being, a flawed man, stands there and speaks the words of consecration, "This is my body,"
A radical implication arises that challenges our entire perception of reality.
the idea that a man in a specific fleeting moment in human time allows his limited human eye to be entirely subsumed by the eternal eye of Christ.
It challenges the very boundaries we draw between time and eternity, between human limitation and divine action.
It is a stunning defiance of modern individualism,
Proposing a thought that is alien to our current culture.
that the ultimate height of human existence, the pinnacle of freedom, is not found in asserting one's own autonomy, but in allowing oneself to be completely overwritten by the divine.